Hi everybody, welcome back. So my name is Jeffrey. I'm going to be talking to you guys about some commonly asked micro and macroeconomics questions. I believe we only have a few questions today, waiting to get an updated list, but picked out some, commonly missed questions. We're going to go over them together. I haven't looked at the answer keys yet, so we'll get an idea of what these questions are together and go over the answers. And then once we've gone over our answer together, we'll also review the answer of a previous tutor to see whether or not the previous tutor answered the question correctly. With that being said, we can jump right in. The first question says the long run growth in GDP is determined by what? And so remember that this is going to be a kind of definition based question. It's going to be testing our knowledge of the productivity function, and we know that that's going to be determined by a number of factors, and those are going to be capital stock, labor force participation, I believe, technology, and putting all this together, you have productivity, right? And so if we have those four things, we can describe how much growth we expect GDP to experience in a given amount of time. Capital stock refers to the availability of physical capital as well as human capital and existing capital and resources. Labor force refers to the size of the population that you're able to employ. Labor force participation and refers to how much of the labor force that is possible to employ is actually going to be employed. And technology is going to refer to our ability to combine those resources together, the capital stock we already have, the labor force that we have, into actual products that contribute to GDP. And so if we have those factors, we can get an idea of the long-run growth rate of GDP. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. The previous tutor says, the long-run economic growth of the GDP of a country is determined by its capital stock, labor force participation, labor productivity, and technology. The sustained increase in the quantity of goods and services produced in an economy is described as long-run growth. The ratio of economic output with respect to the quantity of inputs available, namely capital, labor, energy, and raw materials. So so capital, labor, energy, and raw materials would fall under capital stock. We have the labor force participation rate, the availability of technology, and the productivity of labor determines the growth of the economy. So yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with this answer choice, and we're all set to move forward with that. Great answer. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. So the next question says, in the short run, if the Fed wants to raise the federal funds rate, it 1. Instructs the New York Fed to sell government securities in the open market. 2. Instructs the New York Fed to sell government securities in the foreign exchange market. 3. Instructs the New York Fed to buy government securities in the open market. 4. Instructs large commercial banks to sell government securities in the open market. And 5. Tells large commercial banks to raise their interest rates. So what you're really looking at here is going to be something similar to the money market supply graph, right? So let me see if I can get my mouse working here. Okay, very good. Okay, so what we're talking about is the money market supply graph, or money supply graph. And so we'll draw it out here. So we have the quantity of money on the x-axis, and then we have interest rate on the y-axis. And so we're going to have our money demand curve, and then we have our money supply curve. And money supply, again, is going to be vertical because there's only one nominal value of how much money there is in circulation at a given amount of time. If we were to reduce the amount of money in circulation, we would shift the money supply curve to the left, and if we were to increase the money in circulation, we would shift it to the right. And so the question is, what can we use? What do we expect to happen if we want? what should we do if we want to raise the interest rate, right? And so if the thing that we can change is the money supply, then in order to increase the interest rate, then we would want to shift the money supply curve to the left, right? If we shift the money, this is terrible. If we shift the money supply curve to the left, MS2, MS1, we see that interest rate increases from I1 to I2. And that effectively is going to be our mechanism for increasing the interest rate. So the same thing applies when the Fed wants to raise the federal funds rate. Now let's remember that the federal funds rate refers to the interest rate that commercial banks charge each other if they want to loan money to other commercial banks, right? So the same concept here applies. If we were to shrink the money supply, what it effectively does is it shrinks the credit creating capacity of these commercial banks, and that places pressure on the federal funds rate to increase, right? And so which one of these answer choices, the question we're asking ourselves is, which one of these answer choices is going to shift the money supply to the left? And so looking through the answer choices, it's clear that answer choice 1 is going to be the best answer here. If the Fed instructs the New York Fed to sell government securities in the open market, what they're effectively doing is they're pushing out government securities, which are just like bonds, right, treasury bonds, into the hands of the public or into the hands of commercial banks. And in exchange, they're taking from the public or commercial banks the public or commercial banks' money, right? And so what goes into the economy is certificates, and what comes out of the economy is cash, right, or money. And so that's going to decrease the money supply through this type of open market operation. So 1 is going to be our best answer here. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor has said. So the previous tutor also said 1, instructs the New York Fed to sell government securities in the open market. And they said that the federal funds rate is a rate at which commercial banks extend overnight loans to each other on an uncollateralized basis. Reserve balances are lent by financial institutions to those which are falling short. The federal funds rate is established by the governors of the Federal Reserve through the imposition of open market operations on commercial banks. As the Federal Reserve instructs the New York Fed to sell government securities in the open market, the amount of money available with commercial banks decreases, causing a reduction in their credit creation capacity and enforcing an increase in the federal funds rate. And so again, same concept that we talked about with our solution. So we're going to say correct answer, and we can move on to the next one. Okay, so the next question says a tax on labor income blank, which subsequently blank the equilibrium quantity of labor. And we have answer choice 1 is increases the supply of labor and increases. Answer choice 2 says decreases the supply of labor and decreases. Answer choice 3 says increases the demand for labor and increases. And 4 says decreases the demand for labor and decreases. So what we're dealing with here is the labor market, right? So let's draw out our graphs once again. We have wages on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We have a demand curve, demand for labor, and that's going to be in the form of employers. And then we have our supply curve, our supply of labor, and that's in the form of employees. And so in equilibrium, we have an equilibrium wage, right? Wage star, and we have an equilibrium employment level, Q star, right? And so this is our labor market. Pretty simple. Again, just to review, there's a misconception that supply of labor is going to refer to the number of jobs. That's not the case. It's going to be referring to a number of people willing to work at a given wage. If we are to increase wages, then more people would be willing to work. If we were to decrease wages, less people would be able to work. And that's why supply of labor is upward sloping. In the same time, demand for labor is downward sloping because if we want employers to pay high wages, then they can only afford or only want to pay for a few workers. And if we tell them they can pay very low wages, then they can afford to employ a lot of workers. And that's going to explain the downward sloping nature of the demand curve. And so the question is, a tax on labor income, what does that does it affect supply? Does it affect demand? If it affects supply or demand, does it increase or decrease those aspects of the labor curve. And so a tax on labor income refers basically to income tax, right? And so who does income tax affect more? Does it affect employers, which would mean it would affect the demand curve? Or does it affect suppliers of labor, which would mean it would affect the supply curve? And so the question is, of course, the income tax is going to affect the suppliers, the people who are in the labor force, because it reduces the amount of wages that people actually take home when they work for a certain wage, right? So if I worked for a wage star, I would actually only take home this much money, right, instead of wage star amount of money, because some of that money is getting taxed. And so it's going to be affecting the supply curve. So we can eliminate answer choice 3 and 4. The next question is, okay, if it affects the supply curve, does it increase the supply of labor or does it decrease the supply of labor? And again, we have to think, well, income tax is going to reduce the amount of money that people take home when they are paid a certain wage. And in that fact, it decreases the incentive to work. So it's going to be a factor or determinant that decreases the supply of labor, right? And we're going to visualize that as a leftward shift in the supply curve. So this leftward shift is going to be our new supply curve, which gives us a new equilibrium at W2 and Q2. And so what we've seen is the answer to the first part of the question is that a tax on labor income is going to decrease the supply of labor, and that subsequent change is going to cause a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor as well. We used to have Q star level of employment, and now we have Q2 level of employment. And so the answer to the second part of the question is decreases as well. And so the correct answer is going to be answer choice 2. A tax on labor income decreases the supply of labor, which subsequently decreases the equilibrium quantity of labor. Now we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor also said answer choice 2 decreases the supply of labor and decreases. And they say that the imposition of a tax on labor income reduces the incentives to work when a proportion of the income earned by workers goes to tax. This leads to a reduction in the supply of labor that causes the supply curve to shift to the left. The reduction in the supply consequently causes a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor. The equilibrium quantity of labor decreases as the cost of labor has increased for businesses due to the tax. The workers now require a greater income to offset the effect of the tax. Again, great answer. Explains all the things that we talked about. We just want to make sure, be familiar with the labor market graph. And so other than that, the solution is correct, and we can move on to the next answer. The next question. Okay, so the next question talks about the CPI, and it says, which of the following causes changes in the CPI to overstate the true inflation rate? So one says, one says new product bias, 2 says substitution bias, 3 says an increase in quality bias, and 4 says all of the above. So let's break this down. What is the CPI? So the CPI refers to a consumer price index, and we have to be familiar with how it's calculated in order for us to be familiar with the type of biases that it might experience. So CPI is a tool that economists use to track inflation rate over time. So inflation is basically how price levels increase over time. The CPI, in order to track that, is calculated in the following manner. So economists establish a basket of goods, which means that they choose a collection of goods which they think represent the overall cost of living for a family of 4, let's say, in the economy in a certain year. So in 2010, the CPI is calculated by taking this basket of goods and seeing how much does this entire basket of goods cost. And a basket of goods might be like 2 dozen eggs, a loaf of bread, cost of a new computer. So something that represents the overall cost of living in a certain year. The CPI event takes the prices of all the basket goods and adds them all up, and that's your CPI for that year. And then, that's not your CPI for that year, but that's the cost of goods for that year. And so the CPI for that year is 1, and that year would be the base year. And then you have, in order to calculate the rate of inflation between two different years, if we're using 2010 as a base year, we might go to 2011 and take the exact same basket of goods and the exact same quantity of those goods. So all the goods are the same, and take the prices in 2011 instead of the prices in 2010, and then calculate the total cost of the basket of goods in 2011. And so what we assume is going to happen is that some of the prices, at least, of those products in the basket are going to change in a span of 2010 to 2011. And therefore, the cost of the overall basket is going to change as well. And the difference between the cost of the baskets is going to be used in our calculation for inflation. And so that's the way we use CPI to calculate inflation. So now the question is, why might this not be a super accurate way of calculating inflation? And so that's where we come into these types of biases. So let's talk about each of the biases that are listed. So new product bias refers to the idea that as time goes on, the CPI basket might not actually reflect the same goods that are typically used by people in a new year for their standard cost of living. A great example is changes in technology. And so we can think of products that probably didn't exist in 2000, for example, cell phones, that now exist in 2020. Those products are not going to be included in the CPI basket using 2000 as a base year because they simply did not exist in 2000. And yet they are a staple in the standard things that someone might want to buy in 2020. And so that discrepancy between a product that is very much a part of life today that did not exist 20 years ago means that it can be hard to calculate the true inflation change between the base year and the new year. And the reason for that is because some people might be looking at new products as a way to substitute for old products. And so that goes into the second type of bias, substitution bias. And so in this way, substitution bias suggests that when prices go up, consumers are going to substitute away from the goods they used to buy in favor of the substitute goods instead. One example might be if we had originally in the base year apple juice as one of the items in the basket, and in the last 10 years, the price of apple juice has skyrocketed and has tripled or quadrupled in price. CPI would assume that people continue to buy apple juice at the same rate, where in fact, in reality, people very likely have substituted away from buying apple juice in favor of cheaper substitutes like orange juice or grape juice. And those goods might have stayed at lower prices. And so the actual spending that people are engaging in is actually still low because of the substitution effect. And that's not reflected in the CPI because CPI assumes that the same goods that people consume in the base year are goods that are being consumed at that same rate in the current year as well. And so that's going to be another reason for bias. And third is an increase in quality bias, in which there's a possibility that prices did in fact go up, but not as a result of inflation, but as a result of an increase in quality. We can think of, I'm not sure if this is historically accurate, but let's say a car used to be used in the calculation of CPI. Well, in the last 20 years, or let's say last 40 years, cars may have gotten more expensive, but the question is that only a sole result of inflation? And the answer is no. Cars have partly become more expensive because there's a lot more safety technology involved in these cars. There's a lot more engine power in these cars. There's a lot more fuel efficiency in these cars. And so part of the reason these cars are more expensive is because they're simply better than they used to be. And so that's going to be a reflection of an increase in quality and not a reflection of any type of inflation. And so CPI would assume that all the price change that cars may have experienced in the last 40 years is a result of changing prices, when in fact some or maybe a lot of the price change is actually a result of increase in quality. So that's going to be another reason in why CPI is going to overstate the true inflation rate. And so we can see that all three of these answer choices are going to be reasons why the CPI overstates inflation. And so we're going to go with answer choice 4, all of the above, as our reasons for causing change. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said all of the above, and they said the consumer price index is an index used in the measurement of changes in the price level of a particular weighted average market basket of consumer goods and services calculated on a monthly and annual basis. The consumer price index does not take into account the substitution effect, which is observed when the changes in the price of a particular good or service leads to a change in the demand for its substitutes. The market basket does not change to reflect the response of consumers to changes in relative prices, and hence the CPI ends up overstating the true rate of inflation. Quality bias is another mismeasurement, as the data regarding the change in the quality of goods is not incorporated in price indices such as the CPI. Quality is not a quantitative variable and hence causes the CPI to overstate the true inflation rate if there is an increase in the same. And new products that are introduced in the economy do not find an immediate inclusion in the measurement of consumer price index either, contributing to a bias. So you're right. Good answer. Effectively breaks down all three types of bias. And so nothing wrong with that answer choice, and we can move on to the next question. So the next question says, which sentence best describes a regressive tax? One says, regressive tax places a higher burden on people who earn less compared to wealthier taxpayers. 2 says, regressive taxes place a higher burden on wealthy taxpayers compared to people who earn less. 3 says, regressive taxes result in poor taxpayers paying no taxes. And 4 says, regressive taxes prevent tax rates from rising over time. And so, again, this is a very definition-based question. And so the question asks us, what is a regressive tax? And so, regressive tax is basically the opposite of a progressive tax. And so this is, progressive taxes are what we see in the United States, where you have tax brackets and the lower income people are going to pay a lower percentage of tax, maybe 10%, whereas as you move up in income and you get placed in higher and higher tax brackets, the more money you make, the more money you pay on the marginal income that you're making. So if you are a millionaire, then the last $200,000 you make might be taxed at 50% rather than the first $10,000, which was taxed at like 10%, right? And so that's what we call a progressive tax rate. The regressive tax is going to flip that, and it's going to place a high burden on the lower income people, and say if the lower income people must pay a 40% tax rate, and as you move up in income and move up in tax brackets, you're going to pay less and less money in taxes. And so that's going to be what we're talking about when we talk about regressive taxes. And so whereas income tax is going to be a progressive tax, Social Security tax is commonly known as a regressive tax because it places a higher burden on low-income people than high-income people. And so answer choice 1 is going to be our best description of regressive taxes. Regressive taxes place a higher burden on people who earn less compared to wealthier taxpayers. And so we can look at the previous tutor's answer choice. The previous tutor also chose answer choice 1. Regressive taxes place a higher burden on people who earn less compared to wealthier taxpayers. And they said a regressive tax is a type of tax that is imposed in a fashion such that the tax rate increases as the income which is subject to taxation decreases. When the average tax rate exceeds the marginal tax rate, as the tax regresses from high income to low income, the distribution of tax on income is considered regressive. In case of a regressive tax, the relationship between the tax rate and the tax rate payer's ability to pay the tax is inverse, and hence the tax burden increases as the income decreases. For example, a lump sum tax is an example of a regressive tax rate as it is based on a fixed amount and not a percentage due to which low income claims a higher proportion to tax. Yeah, great answer. Really covers the definition and gives a good example. A lump sum tax is a regressive tax, and so we can mark that as correct. Okay, Now let's take a look at this question, and it says, in which situation would a certificate of deposit be the best banking choice? And they say answer choice 1, Samuel is setting money aside but still needs emergency access to it. Answer choice 2, Darren is looking for an investment that has a very high interest rate. Answer choice 3, Raj is looking for an investment with a fast return so he can reinvest. And answer choice 4, Hafsa wants a guaranteed return and won't need the money for several years. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is a certificate of deposit? And I think it's going to be easier for us to just look up a quick definition of this. And so we can see here that a certificate of deposit is a secure form of time deposit where money must stay in the bank for a certain length of time to earn a promised return. A CD, also called a share certificate at credit unions, almost always earns more interest than a regular savings account. So let's take a look at which of these is going to be a situation in which that type of account is going to be your best choice. So one says Samuel is setting money aside but still needs emergency access to it. And so if you need emergency access to it, a CD is not going to be the best choice for you because it's going to be money that is locked in to the bank, right? You cannot withdraw that money for a certain period of time, usually a few years. Right? Second, Darren is looking for an investment. Darren is looking for another investment that has a very high interest rate, and so that again is not going to be reflected by a certificate of deposit because Darren is going to have trouble getting a very high interest rate on a savings account, on a certificate of deposit account, because it is such a guaranteed form of account that the interest rate, although higher than a savings account, is only going to be a few percentage points. Whereas you might be looking for something that might have a higher interest rate, like a bond or something like that. 3 says Raj is looking for an investment with a fast return so he can reinvest. And again, a CD is not going to be your best choice when you're doing that because you're going to be dealing with things like you're going to be dealing with the time frame that the certificate of deposit requires you to have in order to be able to withdraw your money after that point in time. So that's not going to work for Raj. And finally, 4, Hafsa wants a guaranteed return and won't need the money for several years. That's going to be the best bet for Hafsa because, again, a CD's guaranteed return, there's very little risk involved. It's much like a savings account, except you can't access the money very quickly, and that's going to be completely fine because Hafsa says he doesn't need the money for several years. So that's going to be the best answer choice number 4. So we can take a look at what the previous tutor said as well. The previous tutor said Hafsa wants a guaranteed return and won't need the money for several years. Samuel can open a savings or checking account. A checking account or transactional account is a deposit account held by an individual or a firm in a financial institution and is generally available at the demand of the depositor. Such an account can be used to set aside regular deposits while also keeping withdrawal channels open. A checking account can be accessed for withdrawals through various means such as debit cards via automatic teller machines, mobile banking, checks, or electronic transfers. Savings accounts enable a depositor to keep aside a portion of their assets and earn regular monetary returns on them through interest rates, but do not allow great mobility in withdrawals. The depositor can only make a limited number of pre-authorized withdrawals from a checking account. Darren can open a money market deposit account that offers higher interest rates than savings or transactional accounts. Raj can invest money market mutual funds to earn dividends. Money market funds have short maturity periods and high interest rates. And Hafsa can best invest in a certificate of deposit. Time deposits that bear interest and mature after a specific period of time. The longer the term of maturity, the higher is the yield. Great answer, and I think the tutor did a great job giving examples of other types accounts that match the other answer choices. And so that's going to be the correct answer as well. The next question says, which of the following scenarios will shift the investment demand curve to the right? So 1 says business taxes increase, 2 says the expected return on capital increases, 3 says firms have a lot of unused production capacity, and 4 says firms are planning on increasing their inventories. So there's multiple answers here that are correct, and so we can take a look at which one of them are correct. One says business taxes increase, and so that's not going to shift investment demand curve to the right. It will most likely shift investment demand curve to the left. Business taxes increasing means there's going to be a greater strain on businesses. More of the business's revenue is going to be paid to the government, which means they're going to have less availability to invest funds, right? And so one is not going to be the right answer here. 2 says that the expected return on capital increases, and so the expected return on capital is going to be a determining factor for investment demand. And so if suddenly we are expecting a higher return on capital that is borrowed, then that's definitely going to shift the investment demand curve to the right, because more firms are going to be incentivized to take on those loans in order to invest in that capital. And so 2 is going to be correct. 3 says that firms have a lot of unused production capacity. And so if firms have a lot of unused production capacity, they're not going to need to do much in terms of loanable funds for investment, because they're able to simply step up their own production capacity without having to take out loans in order to increase their overall production. And so if firms have a lot of unused production capacity, that's not going to shift the investment demand curve to the right. 4, firms are planning on increasing their inventories. And so this is going to be something that is going to shift the investment demand curve to the right as well. The reason for that is because inventories are considered a form of investment. And so if firms are planning on increasing their inventories, they may need to borrow more money in order to step up their production and kind of have enough to both sell to consumers this year and also place into inventories for future years. And so both 2 and 4 are going to be correct. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor also said 2 and 4, the expected return on capital increases and that firms are planning on increasing their inventories. And so let's take a look at their rationale. And the previous tutor says that investments demand curves shift to the right when there's an increase in the investment demand by firms. If there is an increase in business taxes, the profit share of firms will reduce as they receive lower amounts after paying taxes. Hence, the incentive to invest in increased production output will decrease, causing a decrease in investment and shifting the investment demand curve to the left. If the expected return on capital increases, firms will want to invest a greater amount of capital to earn higher expected returns while the opportunity is available. This will increase the investment demand, shifting the curve to the right, so that's the rationale for 2. 3 says if firms have a lot of unused production capacity, they will not feel the need to invest until the available potential is exhausted, hence investment demand is reduced. And 4 says if firms plan to increase their inventories, they will have to invest a greater amount in production to inflate their output. Inventories are also considered investments, therefore the increase in investments will shift the curve to the right. Excellent, so that matches our answers perfectly, and we can say great answer, and no notes are necessary to modify that answer. Next question says, at the price of $15, let's open this image up. At a price of $15, Jack's quantity demand for good A is the same as when the price rises to $16. Jack's demand for good A is which of the following? A is perfectly elastic, B is elastic, C is unit elastic, D is perfectly inelastic, and E is inelastic. And so what we see here, right, elasticity of demand is given by quantity change, percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price, right? So if percentage change in quantity demand is 0, and the percentage change in price is, whatever 1 divided by 15 is, the overall elasticity is going to be 0, right? And so what do we know is the case when elasticity is 0? We're dealing with a perfectly inelastic demand curve. And so the way that looks is going to be something like this, right? We have quantity on the y-axis, price on the x-axis, and we just have a vertical line where we say that quantity demand for this product is completely independent of price, that there's no change in price that would result in any shift in quantity demanded. And so we can think of certain goods as life-saving goods where people are not going to be really swayed by changes of prices in terms of their demand, that they want this good no matter how much it's going to cost. And so that's going to be the right answer here. Answer choice D, perfectly inelastic. And so let's take a look at the previous year's answer. And the producer says D as well, and they said the correct answer is D. If the demand for a good is perfectly inelastic, it means that the quantity demanded does not change as prices change. As Jack's demand for good A is the same regardless of whether the price is 15 or 16, his demand for good A is perfectly inelastic. And that's a good way to approach it. And we can say, good answer. Nothing wrong with that. And we can mark that as correct. And I believe that's all we have for today. A little bit shorter than usual. We just didn't have that much to go over today. So hopefully that was all helpful to you guys. And again, we'll be doing this again on Tuesday and Thursday. Other than that, I hope everybody's staying healthy and safe, and wishing you guys all the best for the rest of the